It's roll call afterwards. Again, folks, as you're coming in, we do not need VCS numbers in the chat. All right, but everybody, thank you. Welcome to the 2021 Virtual Christmas Summit brought to you by Boscoyo Studio. So this presentation by Keith Wesley and David Pitts will be about the new Falcon controllers. Keith does like interactive presentations, so feel free to ask questions, but otherwise please keep your microphone muted and video off if you're not asking a question. Also feel free to ask questions or put any discussions in chat. And again, the raffle will be after this presentation, so no need for VCS numbers or anything regarding that, but stick around afterwards for the raffle. So thank you, Keith and David. Take it away.
All right. So today, Dave and I wanted to introduce the V4 controller. Dave approached me, God, it was, I checked the GitHub repository. It was about June last year where we started work on developing the next version of the V4 controller, and Dave asked me to give him a hand with the firmware, and that's why I'm talking to you today, because for those that you know Dave, he's not a huge fan of presenting, so it's fallen to me. We did decide to include a safe harbor statement. For those of you in IT, you'd be familiar with this. We're going to talk about features which are mostly there, almost there, but there is definitely a risk that there will be some changes over time. And I just wanted people to recognize that that's the case, and that some of the things that we say in here may, through necessity, need to change slightly. And I don't want people to take anything here as gospel. They are as accurate as we can possibly be at this point in time. And as you will see, the vast majority of things are all working and working well. But there are still things that we are finalizing and may need to change as a result of that. So these are the controllers. These are the new F16 and F48 controllers that the Falcon will be introducing to the market. They are in many ways very similar to the previous generation, but with a number of differences. There are some things that have been taken away, but there's also been a bunch of new capability added and a lot of things streamlined. Dave and I have been working very hard on bringing boards to the market that are functionally complete on day one, with all features enabled and working. And that's why we've spent so long in the development process to try and get that right. But we're very close to that right now. All the key features are there. Some new features are there as well. We've been looking and been very involved and seen a lot of people's configurations, and we have tweaked some settings to be more aligned to what we believe most people need. Some people may be frustrated that certain features have dropped by the wayside, but other features will are definitely new and will be hopefully welcomed by the community as being a useful improvement in the way things are done. So at a glance, let's talk about them. Let's compare the F16s and the F48s. So the F16s have the 16 locally fused ports, just like the current version does. The local receiver ports, however, do change. Today, you can just use port 2 to drive a chain of up to 3 receivers. With the new controller, there's the ability to drive 2 chains of receivers, and each chain can be up to 6 receivers. So you can drive in total 12 receivers off of an F16 board with no expansion boards required to do that. There is local DMX port, but there's only one of them. So there used to be 3 of them. There's now only the one of them. And we've dropped support for the very old PixelNet protocol that's no longer commonly used. So you'll be able to drive LOR and DMX, or LOR/DMX via DMX, and Renard off that local DMX port. The board will remain expandable to 48 ports using expansion cards. similar to the current board. So there'll be an expansion, local expansion board for 16 additional local ports, which you can define, you can add 2 of, or you'll be able to add sender cards for the smart remotes, and you'll be able to add up to 8 of those. When you add 8 of those, you won't get the 2 that are currently on board will overlap with 2 of them on the expansion board. So you're really only adding 6 through that process. Pixels per port, we have changed that pretty significantly. So it will now drive up to 32 ports of 1,024 pixels. There's no banks. It's fully capable of 1,024 across all 32 ports. Once you get above 32 ports, once you get into up towards 48 ports, it drops to 704 ports, with one slight caveat: that doesn't give you 704 unique pixels. You're still limited to the input side, which is 192 universes of 512 channels, and that's slightly less than 704 times 48. But you can still drive up to 704 pixels per port. You just don't necessarily have enough input data to uniquely specify those pixels. The universes channels, like I said, goes up to 192 universes. So that's 98,000 channels of data being received over the network. The Wi-Fi is fully functional in terms of all of the web control. You can't receive pixel data over the Wi-Fi. There is no way that Wi-Fi is fast enough for that. But the rest of the user interface is fully functional over Wi-Fi, including things like uploading sequences and audio, etc. if you plan to use your Falcon as an actual standalone show player or in a master remote type mode, that web interface is now fully functional. On the player mode, at this point in time, I don't have final numbers on how many channels will be supported in player mode. For those familiar with the F16 V3, it doesn't support the full set of channels due to the overheads of accessing that data from the SD card. On the F16 V3, you also have to manually copy across to the SD card your WAV files and your version 1 FSCQ files. There's no way to upload those. With the new controller, you are able to upload them. It also supports the new or the newer V2 file formats. It doesn't support the ZSTD compression, but it does support the zlib compression on those FSCQ files. So those FSCQ files are substantially smaller. It will also convert the MP3 files to WAV files for you when you upload them. It does take a little bit of time to do that, but you don't have to go and pull SD cards and load things onto SD cards if you choose to use it in that mode. The input protocols don't change. It continues to support E131, ArtNet, DDP, and ZCPP. On the output protocol side, this has been a strength of the Falcon in terms of the diversity of protocols that it supports. It's going to continue to support those protocols, except for the GECE protocol that is dropping from support. It does support 3 or 4 wire pixels from the main board only. From the remote boards, it generally supports the 2811 pixels only. Potentially some changes there, but generally that's how it is. But it supports a whole bunch of different protocols. It does have fan control, so it still has the fan header on it. The fan has been updated. It's now variable speed. So as the temperature of the board goes up, the fan speed will increase until the board cools down, at which time an appropriately compatible fan will slow back down again to minimize noise. It has 4 input pins. The input pins are changing. The input pins are now much easier to access. The old ones had a header that was extremely hard to use. It was hard to find the plugs that would go onto it. They're now screw terminals. So if you want to use the terminals to trigger activities either locally on the Falcon board or have it send the event to your FPP show player or your X schedule show player, you can do that. The driver resistors have all been changed to be 33 ohms to allow us to drive pixels over a greater distance. And the frames per second continues to be 40 frames a second up to about 680 pixels, after which it will degrade just due to the time that it takes to send the data out to the pixels along the wire. So fully capable. The F48, there are some changes on the F48 as well. I don't know if you noticed them in the image, but there are some local ports on the F48. We find that the vast majority of people who build an F48 then also want to have 4 local ports located right next to the controller. So we have decided to add 4 local reports directly onto the F48 board. They then are mapped to one of the receiver chain ports so that you can use that there instead. It will support 12 receiver chains of up to 6 receivers on each chain. Now, just like the F16, thank you, Daryl. Just like the F16, the pixels on the receivers are shared. So although you can have 1024 or 704 pixels on one of these, they are shared across the 6 receivers. So it turns out to be just over 100 odd per receiver, although you have flexibility of defining how big each one is, and that's independent. The one other thing I should mention, which I didn't mention properly in the F16 one, is that protocols on the F16 V3, you can have a different protocol on every single port. This is not true with the new board. The new board, each bank of 16 will be 1 pixel protocol. So you can choose, something exotic like a TLS 3001 on your first 16 ports, and then 2811 on your next 16 ports. What you can't do is have port 1 is a TLS 3001 and port 2 is a UCS 403 or whatever. You can't mix them up at that level. You can just do it on banks. It's generally not a big deal. Most people generally run the same protocol for all their pixels. But yeah, that capability has been lost. Local DMX ports, yes, again, it drops to 1. Pixels per port is 704 because it's a 48 port controller. The universe input channels is still 192 universes. The Wi-Fi and player capabilities, etc., are all the same. The only other thing that's materially different here is that the old F48 board required you to provide a 5 volts power supply, recognizing that these days most people, and particularly now that there's a local port attached to the board, we've updated the power supply to be both 5 volts and 7 to 14 volts. So you can just use a single 12 volt power supply to power your F48 rather than having to have a buck converter or a separate adapter to provide the 5 volts to the board. The user interface, we looked long and hard at the user interface and recognized that the Falcon controller interface is one of the most simple for user interfaces for an advanced controller out there. And so as much as possible, we have tried to keep the user interface as similar as possible to the prior generation while introducing the new features where we could. So for the eye candy folks, there is now a dark mode, so you can do dark mode for your controller. You can now color tag your controllers so that it's easier to see which controller you're logged on to at a particular point in time. Being the author of the visualizer in xLights, we've also introduced a visualizer concept into the Falcon controllers where you can visualize what's attached to the ports. It's not at the point yet where you can actually manipulate the configuration. Much like the xLights one, we've introduced it as a visualizer of how you've consumed your pixels rather than at this point a configuration utility, but we may get there. The descriptions fields are now expandable, so it's easier to edit them. We have null nodes now at the end of strings, not just at the beginning of strings, recognizing that there are a number of situations where models it makes sense to have the null nodes at the end of the string rather than defined at the beginning of the string. So we're hoping that that will make certain tree configurations and the like a lot easier to do. We now have 4-channel color reordering. So if you're using 4-channel pixels and you need to reorder your channel data, move the W channel from the beginning to the end, that's now all supported. We now have testable inputs using the web UI. One of the things that I've seen many times as we've gone through support situations is people plug things into the controller but don't realize that they've got the number of the port wrong. And so there's now a test mode where you can put it into number mode and it will light up the number of pixels that represent the port that you've actually plugged it into as a way to troubleshoot things more easily. The input pins now have testable capabilities through the web UI, so you can verify that they're working. The ArtNet and ETH131 definition has all been aggregated, so you don't need hundreds of lines of entries on the E131 page. It's much simpler. There's now internet time server support, so it can reach out to an internet time server to pull down the time rather than you having to enter the time. It has notification of web updates, so it will let you know when there is new firmware. You can add a vanity show logo to your show, so if you want to show in the top right-hand corner a logo representing your show and put some branding on your show, you can now do that. And it also supports full web-based firmware updates, etc. So again, you don't necessarily have to go and pull SD cards to do updates on your firmware. Lots and lots of changes. When you get into it, it doesn't look that different, but behind the scenes, there's been a full rewrite of this interface. Any questions before I move on?
Will that
Will the new UI work for the F16 V3? No, it won't. It's an entirely new platform. The visualizer, much like the original xLights visualizer, is simple in the first instance, but it does give you that ability to see the number of pixels that are available on a port and how they've been allocated. It lets you see where they've been assigned to smart remotes. You can see your virtual strings all nicely separated, etc. So yeah, a way to visualize things. The smart remotes are also changing and are incompatible with the old smart remotes. This is necessary in order to support the expanded number. As I said, if you're using smart remotes on a controller configured with 32 ports, then you get 1,024 pixels per output, 704 if you're on an F48 or you've got more than 32 ports defined. You can split, each port allows you to split the smart remote. So your first smart remote on a chain might have 50 pixels on port 1 and 60 pixels on port 2, and then you might reverse it on the next smart remote, etc. And that's fine. You don't have to have them as fixed. You can use the old remotes in dumb mode. So the very, very old original version of the remotes and also the old smart remotes in dumb mode, but you can't use them as smart receivers. The protocol that talks to the smart receivers is different in the new boards in order to support this. There is a rotary switch there for setting it. So instead of having hundreds of dip switches, there's now a relatively simple rotary switch used to set which mode it's in. The smart remote is slightly larger just to fit all of the components onto it. And we have got rid of the unused 4th pin on those remotes as well, making it absolutely crystal clear there's no clock signals on these smart remotes. The 16-port local expansion board. So when you've got one of them, obviously this gives you ports 17 through 32. Once you've got 2 of them, obviously you're above 32, and so the port reduces. It's now a direct ribbon cable rather than a daisy chain, potentially making it easier to wire your boxes up. And it's a smaller form factor, so you'll find that this expansion board is a little bit smaller than the last version of it. The differential expansion boards are also very similar to the previous versions. Again, a direct 24-pin ribbon cable rather than the larger ribbon cable daisy chain that the current one has. Will the functionality, so there's some obvious questions that I guess I wanted to put out there. I mean, I have seen there's some questions here. Did we make the power connectors more secure to the boards? We talked about the power connectors, and we decided to stay with the same current power connectors because of their ability to allow you to connect a larger gauge wire. The alternate power connectors out there do not support a larger, large gauge wires correctly. You end up with quite dangerous short circuit potential. So we decided not to go that way. Will the functionality of the controller be complete when released? Our intention is to have the board fully functional on day one when it is released. Obviously, we're still shaking out some of the bugs in the firmware, but yeah, we're not planning on leaving features as to be released. The boards are exactly the same dimensions as the previous boards, so you will be able to use the same sort of holes, etc. At this point in time, we are not planning a V4 of the Falcon 4. We're not ruling it out. It's just definitely not something that we're planning to deploy in the short term. The specification sheet, it's not available yet. I know Daryl was working on it, and we will be making a specification sheet available once we know that the specifications are final and that we're not going to change it. The audio out absolutely does work. I've got it working right here. It works on the F16 V3 as well. Will the upload of the configuration be supported? It will be. The xLights changes have not been built yet, but there will be a full integration with xLights as the previous boards had, and hopefully we'll have that out before the board is released properly. And will the boards integrate with an FPP master remote setup seamlessly? Look, our plan is to try and make it as simple as possible for you to integrate the Falcon boards with a show that is playing off FPP, and where you choose to install the data locally rather than transmit it over the network. We're hoping that you will be able to read it locally off the SD card. As I said earlier, we're not at a point yet where we're absolutely sure exactly how many pixels worth of data we're going to be able to read off that local SD card. We're still working on that. Other questions like, when can I be a tester? Look, we will go through a test phase. The test phase process, to be honest, we will be hand selecting the appropriate people that we want to work with based on people generally that we've worked with before, that we know have invested a lot of time in helping getting the controllers to be robust. So there is a chance that Dave will call for some assistance and in the forums, etc. But at this point in time, that hasn't been decided. Will it have Wi-Fi enabled? Yes, it does have Wi-Fi enabled. And when will it be available? Our plan at the moment is to have it available in July for immediate shipping. So we'll manufacture a whole bunch of boards over the next couple of months. Like I said, we're currently finalizing our testing to make sure that everything's as bulletproof as it can possibly be, and building the test boards. Okay. All right, I touched that. On the protocol side of things, the protocol support will be extensive. Again, this is subject to testing. We're still testing a number of these protocols. We've put a bunch of work into trying to be clearer around which protocols are compatible with other things. So yeah, that's all the protocols. So, and there's some additional specifications. These are largely things which it already overlaps with other things that we've already talked about or already exist in the current board. So a lot of the things are already there. So do you want to see it? Should we actually fire it up?
Let's see this thing. Come on.
So this is it on my test bench right now.
Oh,
this is
I think we're going to need it.
It's a little blurry, I know, and I can't help that.
Oh, looks good.
It's a version 1.0 board, if I can get that out of the way. The 1.00 board. This was built back in February. It's had a few changes, a couple of changes since then, but not that many. There's a lot of wires on it. Some of those are test wires. Some of them are just because I've got certain things plugged in. That's the audio board plugged in. These are the new headers for the inputs. And so you can see that they're quite simple to just pull out and plug in, and they're screw connectors. So if you wanted to put buttons out there, the audio connector is there, plugged in there. It may flip around in the final release, but yeah, that's there. These are your two smart remote ports and your one DMX port over here. The battery for the battery back clock sits underneath the OLED, but if you're going to be internet connected, you won't need that because it'll pick time up from the internet. The two connectors are here. So let's screens going left, right, and center here, guys. Where are we? So the new UI looks very much like the old UI, but I'll walk you through some of the changes. With the board configuration, we've gone and actually been really explicit about the board configurations to try and make it easier. It's currently in 16 local ports, but there is a 16 local ports with your two smart receiver chains on the receiver ports. 16 plus 16, 16 plus 16, plus the two smart receiver ports. So when you add the first expansion board to the Falcon, you still get to use those two smart receiver chains, but if you choose to use them, you're obviously now above 32 ports and you're down to the 704 pixels per port at that point, whereas if you're running it in 16 plus 16 mode, you get a full 1024 pixels on every port. But you get to choose which mode you're in. The controller modes, you get your DDPs, you get all your master and remote player modes, etc. in here. Other than that, there's not a lot that's changed here. There's a little bit of color coding when the temperature exceeds the various thresholds. You'll get eye candy in terms of color. You can choose to put a show logo up here in the top right hand corner. So if you want to put your show branding on it so that when you go to your controllers, it's got your name of your show here, etc. You can put an image file onto the SD card and the web interface will load that and present it. Everyone likes a bit of eye candy. And while we come to that, you can set a controller color. So I can come here and choose a color, and you can see at the top of the screen here, it puts a nice color bar on so I can identify my color. And if I want to go into dark mode, I can go into dark mode on the UI and support all of that. The test screen doesn't change dramatically. I know there's a couple of anomalies in the current one that most of those I think have been worked out. There's not a hell of a lot other than the new number test mode, which exists. Not a lot has changed there. On the input side, so these are those 4 input pins. There's a whole range of things that you can do, including if you want to put an external reboot button on your box, you could potentially attach that to one of the input pins, set it to an input, and then when you press the button, the controller would reboot. So you've got options like that. The network side, nothing's changed significantly. You have all of your usual Wi-Fi settings and things there. On the E131 side, you now don't need 32 lines to represent 32 universes of E131 data. You just need a single line. And so life gets a little bit easier there. On the Pixel front, obviously with the very smart remote remotes, there's a bit of change here, but it's largely the same. If I go back to and add some smart receiver ports here and let it reboot, which it does fairly quickly these days, and I go back to my Pixel ports here, you can see down here where I can add my smart remotes. I can add up to 6 of them. So we're up to C, D, E, and F. So 6 changes of 6 receivers on a single port, and you can then add all the usual virtual strings and everything else. You do get your start nulls and your end nulls. The end nulls are new. You never used to have those. Other than that, the capabilities here are largely similar. The description fields now do expand out so that you can type longer descriptions in without struggling to see things. But everything else here is largely the same. There is some other things up here. So I don't know if you ever got your Falcon into a situation where some of the ports were invalid. They were referencing inputs that were invalid, and everything went red and you had to go and manually go and clean all of that up. I've added a button here for clean invalid, which will go and clear out any ports which are invalid. So with a single button click, you can clean up the user interface at that point. This is also where the visualizer appears. You can open that up, and here you can see the ports that are defined. That's a bug that should be filled in. And as you mouse over things, you can see the tooltips pop up and tell you the configuration of that particular port. As you add things like virtual strings and the like, those also appear in the visualizer. Well, they would appear in the visualizer if I save them. That's not good. And so, yeah, they'll appear in the visualizer here along the line, and you can see how it steadily eats up the gray bar. And when you get to the end here, you know your ports are full. So you can, at a single glance, you can look down and see how many pixels you've consumed across each port there. On the serial outputs are fairly simple because obviously you no longer have that ability to remap. The mapping of these those remote ports is now fixed. So when you're in 16 port mode, they're fixed map to port 17 through to 24. And when you're in, when you've got 32 local ports, then they're fixed map to 33 through to 40. You don't get to remap them like you used to do on the V3. The protocols are just DMX and Renard in the serial port mode. And then in the settings, there's just a few things, so things like time server settings and the like that you can define in there. Once you go to player mode, things change slightly. In player mode, you get the file manager, and the file manager allows you to upload FSCQ files and MP3 files and WAV files for the player to play with. You get playlists where you can go in and define both audio only, audio and FSCQs, as well as just animations that you might want to play. Look, it's a relatively basic show player, as you would expect. If you want more advanced show player features, I would encourage you to use FPP or xSchedule or something like that. But you can have the first song play once, the last song play once, and you can edit the song order and add pauses and things like that. But just basic functionality, essentially. On the schedule side, you can then go and schedule your playlists. It supports about 16, I think, schedules with priority So you can have overlapping schedules. You can limit it to certain days of the week. You can send times. You can have things running 24 hours a day. It quite happily runs things across midnight, so you don't need to stop everything at 11:59 at night and then restart it at 12 o'clock in those sorts of things. That sort of thing. And then finally, there is a continuous mode for people that want to use this thing just as a continuous player in certain circumstances. The thing you need to understand is that the Falcon controller, at the end of the day, while it's big in the hobby and it's used by lots of people in the hobby, Dave sells the Falcon controller into a number of different markets, and some of their needs are a little bit different. And so there's features like that that appear for other use cases. So that's the new Falcon Web UI. As you can see, it is largely complete. All of this stuff does actually work. There are anomalies. There are, you know, the odd bug here and there, but it is functionally complete. This thing is not a long way away from release or pilot.
Keith, the voltage 1 and voltage 2 are different. Is that true? Are you really feeding at 5 volts and 12 volts on each side?
So you are able to plug different voltages into both sides, just like you have always been able to do on the Falcons.
But is that, are you running that on your test bench board?
Oh yes, I'm currently running 5 volts. So this is a 5 volt from the buck converter. So I'm running 5 volts on this half, and I'm running 12 volts on. Oh, sorry, I'm pointing at it, and then I don't have the video camera on it.
Okay, because that was a bug on the V3, where it would report 12 volts as 5. I just wondered if that got fixed.
No. This wire here goes to my buck converter here, which is driving 5 volts into this half, and I've got 12 volts plugged into this half from this switch.
Okay, great.
So yeah, if I do that, have I got any pixels? I've got no pixels plugged in. I'll unplug the 5 volts, plug in 12, and we'll go back, and there it is, 11.6 volts.
Okay, thanks.
There is a discrepancy between it. That's just due to the variations in the resistors for the voltage divider.
Right.
Any other questions?
I've seen one a while back talking about price. I don't know if that's out there or not.
Oh, that's a question for David. I don't answer things like that.
Sounds good.
I do have a question. I know at one point, in addition to the newer versions of these boards, which we're all very much grateful for, there was also a discussion of working on kind of a Raspberry Pi version of the Colt boards, if you will.
Yeah. Dave, do you want to talk to that?
Yeah, we're not announcing that at this presentation, but you know, that is in the works, but
Okay.
not the top priority right now, but you know, it's not that far off.
Okay.
You know?
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. Thank you.
That would be an FPP based Pi board.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I was just
I
curious.
had a question. The F16, you were able to do 2 expansions, 16 port expansions. I didn't see a second port. How does that work?
So there is, if I go back to the image here, because it's a little clearer, there are 2 ports here.
Okay. So they just buy.
Right, so this one here does your first expansion. This one here does your second expansion, right? And these 2 receiver ports overlap with 8 of these, and that's why it's fixed.
Perfect. Thank you.
For the serial port that's there, do you still have the pins to flip it between DMX and LOR?
Yeah, there they are, just there.
All right, perfect. Wasn't sure. Thanks.
Yep.
A lot of people are asking if the new smart receivers will work on the existing controllers as smart receivers.
No, they won't. The protocols that the smart receivers receive from the board are by necessity very, very different. The protocol that's currently used in the smart remotes just wouldn't scale without having other very, very bad side effects. So we decided not to go that way.
We're also going to keep selling the we call it the Smart Receiver version 1. That's the current version. The new ones are the Smart Receiver version 2. So we'll be still selling the version 1 for the foreseeable future, like years to come. So if you have an F48, an older F48, or an F48 or an F16 V3 with a differential expansion board, or even directly from those, all the receivers, you'll be able to get them. It just won't be the version 2.
Excellent.
And the old ones will always stay white, with the white F16 V3s and F48s. All the new boards will be blue, so it'll be easy to tell the difference between the two. Now, having said that, we're working on the new version being able to be connected to an older F16 V3, as well as the cult boards and the new ones. So the new receivers should work with all three of the, any past F48s, F16s. It's just you can't use the old with the new F16 V4 or the F48 V4.
Dave, there's word that you're going to be sold out of the first batch very, very quickly. What's your supply you're anticipating to have?
Well, after you buy 500, I'll have a couple thousand left. No, I don't think there's going to be any major supply issues with the boards.
Okay, so you're not anticipating shortages?
Not at this time.
Okay.
Is there gonna be like a pre-buy or like a wait list or something?
No,
Yeah.
we're going to announce them for sale. I guess if you consider it kind of like we do now, where we do where you click on it, says it won't be shipping till July, whatever, and you can order it, in June sometime. Yeah. But it won't be like a pre-buy. What's
You're
that?
going to be fixing the website for the Canadians or other countries? Do you still have to go through the email processes?
There's only 3 countries that I ship to directly, or 4 that I will be shipping to you. Right now, you could check out, if you're in Australia, you could use the store. We'll be adding Canada and the United States, and those are the only 3 countries that we plan to support right now, possibly New Zealand.
Perfect.
Well, David, I'm in Colorado Springs. Can I just come by your shop and pick mine up?
Sure. You got to bring some barbecue or whatever.
Okay.
What are some of the other ports that are on there that are showing?
Other ports, you mean? Oh, which board?
Yeah, like those ones and
these ones here. These are the input pins. So these allow you to have those input action triggers, which are defined on the input tab here, and so you can have the controller reboot. This is in player mode, so you can create some physical buttons to control, moving to the next song in your playlist. But you can also, send an FPP event off to to your show player potentially, and have your FPP do something, that sort of thing. So that's those ones there. Which other ports? These are the expansion ports that connect off to your expansion cards. These are obviously your 2 Ethernet connectors. These 2 are your receiver ports for your smart receiver chains. This is your DMX port. These are obviously your 16 pixel output ports. And this is an optional separate power connector if you don't want to power it via the V2 connector.
What's that red thing in the center there, the green?
This is just a power bridge on this board. It's just got the 2 sides bridged together. I do the same thing here on mine in the video here. This cable here is just bridging the power between the left and the right hand side to save me having to power it
twice. It's just a test thing.
Yeah. Okay. It's not part of the original final board. They'll be pixel ports. When we test it, we commonly do this.
Are the power ports on the bottom still one side is negative positive and the other side is negative positive opposite?
Yeah, that's for board routing reasons. Yes, they are.
Okay.
Over here, obviously, these are your local pixel ports, the fuses for it and the power that will drive those ones. So you don't need to put that smart remote into the box with the F48 if you want to run some local pixels close to the controller.
Are those ports 1 through 4 then?
I can't remember, Dave.
No, they're ports 40. That's a good question. No, they're 45 to 48. And it's a 45 to 48A if you're in smart receiver mode, and it's just 45 to 48 if you're in dumb mode. So it'll know what you have the user interface set to, whether it's a smart or dumb. And if it's smart, they'll be 45 to 48A.
And how many pixels do those hold? Those 4 ports?
You can run up to 704 off each one.
Okay, thank you.
Which buffer chips are you using on those ports on the F16 V4?
I think they're a latch chip just to stay in suit with what we had before. Even though you don't really need a latch anymore, since we have independent pixel ports going to each output, just to keep it the same as we had before with part sourcing and all that. There's some type of latch chip. If you want to know the actual part number, I could send me an email and I'll send it to you. I don't have it offhand. I think it's definitely ends in 573.
And the resistor chips on the F16, are those replaceable with like the 33 ohm?
Well, they're going to be the 33 ohm. They're going to come 33 ohms. We're actually thinking about making them non-replaceable just because we can't imagine that anybody would want to switch it from the 33 ohms for the most part, so.
So how much distance does that give it?
That's a good question. And really it depends on your wiring and stuff, but it should go further than the F16 V3 just through Keith's testing. I think he presented that.
So with those
he just did a
33 ohm
video on YouTube about changing all that stuff out. It's searchable.
Steve Nye Family Lights YouTube video this weekend showed 80 feet running 200 pixels without an F amp.
Yeah, again, it depends on the quality of wire. Sounds like you probably had some pretty decent wire.
Yeah, he was using 18 gauge, but so essentially with the 33 ohms, then we might not necessarily need any F amps for these boards, then, right?
You definitely won't need them as often.
Yeah.
I see 2 sets of switches there. One is for power and
the other one switches it between the input connect, whether you're coming off the right side power connector or that external power connector. A lot of people, when they run 5 volts, like to come in with a 5 volt supply externally from the controller. That way, when the pixels turn on, the 5 volts doesn't dip, and the electronics seem to like that a little bit better when there's no dip. It's normally the externally is only used when you're running 5 volt pixels and you have a heavy load.
Okay, and still pulling power off of V2 then.
Correct. It's still like, yeah, maybe you want to, you want you have a 5 volt power supply dedicated to V2 and then a small little wall wart or something, or coming in on the external.
But essentially this on the original boards used to be jumpers. These days it's switches. This is the 5 volts versus 7 to 14 volts. And this is the external, use this power connector or use this power connector to power the board. And that's all they do.
Just clarifying.
Yeah, the last couple of versions of the F16 V3 had those switches on there. It's been probably almost 2 years since we've had those.
Yeah, we've also made some changes on the user interface of the OLED itself. So things like, if I want to reboot the board here, if I just hold down the boot button, it'll take 5 seconds, but it takes a little bit longer on my computer because the video is delayed, but it reboots after 5 seconds. You can actually reset the controller back to its shop state by holding down the select and the boot buttons, and you just hold those down for 5 seconds and it will totally reset the controller. No need to go into the web UI or anything. You can even reset it into slightly different modes with different combinations of key presses. This web UI is largely the same as previously. You've got access to all the test modes, all the various configurations. You can see all the power measurements, etc., all on that little UI. You can't really see it there. I know it's blurry because the camera won't focus on it, but it's also got additional details about the mode and the data that's receiving and so forth.
What's the other button up by the radio transmitter?
That button is for testing, and it probably won't be. I've kept it on the F16 V3s, but this board probably won't come with that button or a couple other headers that are on there now. So it's mainly a reset button for the ESP module.
Thank you.
So you talked about getting rid of the ribbon cable and going to a cat cable. Are you not doing that then?
This board will always have the ribbon cable. We are thinking of making another board that will plug into the ribbon cable connectors that will allow you to possibly run 4 16 port long distance expansion boards with a Cat5 cable. But on this board, the ribbon cables will be the main, entry point to that chain.
Okay.
There'll be an adapter board that plugs into the ribbon cables, but that'll be to be announced at a later date.
In the bottom right
Ethernet?
corner,
What's that?
in the bottom right corner, you have the power plug for the V2, but it looks like there's only one terminal in there. Is that just power, or is what's going on with that?
I don't. That'd be a question for him.
That's a optical illusion. There's 2 wires.
It's the same as the one on the left. It's the
There's
same
a
as the one on the
finger
left.
there. There's a finger over it.
Yeah, I think so.
Got it.
Yeah, he was turning it with a screwdriver or something. Looks like, or something.
Is the internet on this 10100 or is it gigabit?
It's 10100.
Boo.
Well, rather than put a $10, $15 part on every board, we just thought it may be easier for you to buy a gigabit switch. Not everybody really wants to absorb that cost on every board. Plus, it would only really be used when you're chaining 5 or 6 of these together, because if you're connecting into a gigabit switch directly, then it really doesn't need to be a gigabit. You would only want to have that if you're for chaining 6 or 7 together.
That was actually my question. So you can actually daisy chain.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it daisy chaining. The word would probably be better used, would be cascade, because you're basically cascading switches. Because each board's like a switch, so you'd be cascading them, and you'd only want to cascade so many anyway, because you normally in with switches you don't cascade 5, 6 switches in a row, typically.
But would there be any kind of latency, network latency by doing that?
Well, I mean, with all switches there is network latency. At what magnitude to where it would affect the lights blinking is probably negligible if you're doing 4 or 5. I know shows that we have had drive-throughs that are doing 4 or 5, and you can't really tell.
We had
again, you probably don't want to go more than that, 2 or 3 or 4, I would think.
We had a customer daisy. We had a customer daisy chain, 6 of them. And they was pushing them all fairly hard, and we did see quite a lot of lag run down the line. So
and you would have probably saw that with any switch, that if you cascaded 6 switches of anything together. So,
when we saw what he'd done, we immediately said, go and buy a proper switch and plug them in, and it fixed it.
Well, the switch chip's actually really good. It's a proper switch, but again, when you got 6 of them connected, at home you wouldn't have 6 switches cascaded.
All right, so we've got about 2 minutes before we need to probably wrap this up. So people are going to come in for the raffle. Is there anything else Keith or David, you'd like to announce?
I got a question about Dave's boards from a production side. Yeah, real quick, from a production side, and I'm a noob at that. I know nothing about it, but you talk about how this board will probably not have this feature or not have that button. So I get from that you haven't ordered these boards yet. And
so far we've only said the only thing it wasn't going to have is that little test button. I just don't want to populate a button no one's ever going to use, because you don't need it.
All right, so they'll definitely be available in July then.
Oh yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
And you'll be taking trade-ins?
Yeah, if you give me, $200 and trade in your board, then we'll.
I'll trade my money for your board.
Will pricing be similar?
It's going to be very similar. The F48 might increase some, $10, $15, just because we put a receiver right on board with it. So.
What about the smart receivers?
I want them all.
They should be within $1 or $2 of each other of what they're at now. I can't imagine that those would go up too terribly much.
Thank you.
I'd just like to say that in case Dave and Keith and everybody hasn't heard this enough, thank you for all that you guys do. Every time you put out a new product, it's just amazing, the thought and the process and the work that you guys put into it. On that
Thanks.
note, is there any plans on like version 2 to eliminate power injection? You know, run a couple thousand pixels with no power injection at 100%?
Is that a joke?
All right,
Yeah,
let's
I'm coming out with one. It's gonna use
let's
the
wrap
flex
it up so we can
capacitor.
stop the YouTube stream and then get on to the raffle. So yeah, thank you very much, Keith and David. I know we're all excited. So I look forward to that one. And hope everybody was enjoying the VCS. And thank you to our sponsors.